Hey everybody, welcome back. This is going to be our last lecture that I will talk about momentarily here. But first, just some quick house cleaning. The exam will open on Thursday at midnight. So the module 4, the final exam for the class, will be available on Thursday at 12 a.m., the 14th at 12 a.m., but it will only be available to you if you have completed the both quiz attempts for each lecture in Module 4. So learning to memory, neuropsychiatric disease, and this lecture, substance use disorder. You need to complete both quiz attempts. Once you complete both quiz attempts, then the final exam will unlock. The final exam will be available from 12 a.m. on the 14th until 11:59 p.m. on the 15th. Okay, so you have all of Thursday, all of Friday to complete the final exam. The quizzes are going to be due at 11:59 p.m. on the 14th. Okay, and so this is not going to be opened up again or whatever. If you miss the opportunity to take the quizzes, then you essentially miss the ability to take the final. So don't do that. I'm going to send an annoying amount of emails and reminders, as I have been throughout the entire semester this summer, reminding you of these due dates. So please do not miss the due dates. The extra credit is also due at 11:59 p.m. on Thursday. Okay, so make sure that you have finished the extra credit and the quizzes by 11:59 p.m. on Thursday. The extra credit for this module is going to be completing the course evaluations. The course evaluations, they should give you some kind of, after you complete it, it should say thanks for completing or whatever, or it should send you some kind of confirmation. Just take a screenshot and upload that, and that will be your extra credit for this module. Super easy. For the course evaluations, I think I already said this in my announcement, but this is the third course that I have facilitated. And it's the first course that I've completely made from scratch. So all of the lecture materials, all of my lectures, everything has been completely from scratch that I've created for this class. And so, I want to, my main job is being a researcher, but I do want to improve my teaching ability. So if you could do me the favor of filling out those evaluations honestly, it would be extremely helpful for me. Plus, it's going to give you 5 extra points for the class. Now, I want to make it clear, though, that I don't want to see what any individual person is putting on the course evaluations. Those are anonymous. So what you're uploading is just the proof that you've completed it, unless I, after recording this, find out that there is no proof. But I'm pretty sure that there's proof for you hitting the submit button or whatever. So you just take a screenshot of that. You show that you have submitted your course evals, and you submit that to me. They're completely anonymous, so it doesn't have any effect. I'm not trying to give you extra credit points to give me a good evaluation necessarily. If you do have a good evaluation, then obviously that will make me happy. But I'm also very interested in constructive criticism, so long as it's constructive. You know what I mean? If you just really hated that all the course assignments were due at a particular time and that rubbed you the wrong way, then whatever. I mean, you can put that, but that's not really what I'm talking about. I think I'm more concerned with, was the information digestible? Were the quizzes and exams, did they feel fair? Were the quizzes exams too easy? Were you thinking, man, this class was kind of a pushover? Don't feel bad about, saying negative things about the course. I want to make the course better. Of course, good course evaluations will help me in the future get jobs or whatever. So if there was, good things about the course, if you thought that the information was digestible, if you thought that I presented it in a way that was good or whatever, then, put those things as well. But whatever it is, I just would like honest feedback. I really care. I'm going to read these. I hope that it's come through in the lectures and through my communication with you all. But I really think that college is an important part of all of our lives, and I really love and enjoy college and the undergraduate part of higher education. So I would really like to be a part of the movement in making sure that our institutions are strong and that you're getting a good education and that you're getting your money's worth for what it is that you're coming to college for, right? So anyway, that's the house cleaning. Make sure that the quizzes you get the quizzes in by 11:59 p.m. on Thursday, which is the 14th, and that the exam is due at 11:59 p.m. on Friday, which is the 15th. So make sure that you don't sleep on that, because I would really hate I really hate giving out zeros, especially for something so silly as missing the deadlines. So good luck with that stuff. So anyways, let's go ahead and get into the lecture now with substance use disorder. Substance use disorder is something that I care deeply about. I think that, initially when I went back to college, it was because I wanted to be a therapist. It was because I wanted to learn more about drug addiction and substance use disorder and psychological pathologies in general. But, over time, I just kind of fell into research, and I kind of really fell in love with the mechanistic explanations of behavior. So that's why I kind of fell into neuroscience. But, my first interest has always been with substance use disorder, with drug addiction, and trying to understand the biological, levers that are making staying sober or clean or maintaining some kind of sobriety or recovering from substance use disorder such a difficulty. And I think that also, substance use disorder is, like we talked about in the previous lecture, one of those pathological outcomes that a lot of people don't have that much sympathy for. I think that people in general understand that substance use disorder and drug addiction is a problem. You know what I mean? I think that people are willing to say, yes, it's, something that people struggle with, and you should be careful with drugs because you don't want to become a drug addict or whatever. But I think that overall, a lot of individuals, when they think about substance use disorder or drug addiction, there is a feeling that it is a kind of a fake disease. You know what I mean? It's one of these things that you just have to use your willpower, and you just have to overcome the childish immaturity or whatever the impulsive behavior is that you're dealing with. So I don't think that there's a whole lot of understanding or empathy for what it is that people that have a substance use disorder are going through. This is also true, as I pointed out in the last lecture, with obesity. I think obesity probably gets the least amount of sympathy in our society, which is why I harped on it so much this semester. But drug addiction is not far behind that, with the lack of kind of empathy or understanding that people give to people that are suffering with substance use disorder. I mean, there's a really hilarious South Park episode where they're making fun of Randy being an alcoholic. I mean, it's a really funny episode, but I would say that it does kind of show the pitfalls that our society has with understanding this disease. Or disorder, depending on what your how you classify it. But substance use disorder is a common model. Oh yeah, so why would we even spend like an entire lecture on substance use disorder other than the fact that I care about it? Well, it's actually like it's one of the biggest fields in behavioral neuroscience, which is biological psychology. So substance use disorder and preclinical models of substance use disorder is a gigantic. I mean, there are hundreds or thousands of researchers that are working on substance use disorder in rat models. There are a lot of them, and it is primarily because substance use disorder allows you to interrogate a lot of basic psychological and biological phenomena. So you have a lot of people that study substance use disorder in the animal world that, they really care about learning and memory, or they really care about the pharmacodynamic properties of drugs, or they really care about the pharmacokinetic properties of drugs. You know what I mean? So but all of those same interests about how drugs work, how drugs affect the body, how your psychology interacts with the addictive properties of drugs, tolerance and sensitization as models of learning and memory we're going to talk about in this lecture. There's a lot of things that substance use disorder touches on, which is relevant to psychology and the basic way that our biology and our mind works. And typically, if you want to figure out how something works, a really good way to understand how it works is by understanding when it breaks, right? So that's why you study diseases and disorders, is one, because you want to cure the disease in the disorder, but it also gives you an opportunity to learn about how things function normally when they're malfunctioning, right? So it's a common model for multiple levels of analysis in behavioral neuroscience, and this is because substance use disorder is a combination of many important aspects of the mind and the biology of the mind, which is learning, reward, motivational states, subjective experience, neurotransmitter systems, and homeostasis. Substance use disorder has to deal with all of those. So substance use disorder is a prevalent disease which affects millions of people. Almost 17% of the population, the United States population, met the DSM-5 criteria for substance use disorder in 2021. Substance use disorder patients have high comorbidities with other psychiatric illnesses, so it's very common that people with SUD will have bipolar disorder or schizophrenia or major depressive disorder, and a lot of times it is extremely difficult to delineate between whether somebody has, quote unquote, a true substance use disorder, or if they are self-medicating a major depressive disorder, and whether or not that, if they could take care of the underlying issue, would they still have a problem with drugs and or alcohol. So that can make it pretty challenging. In fact, in the DSM, most of the disorders and diseases that are talked about include that those symptoms that you're witnessing are not due to the individual having an underlying SUD or being on drugs of some sort. Like, with schizophrenia, if somebody's having auditory hallucinations, you first need to make sure that they're not coming off of a crack or a meth binge. You know what I mean? So 40 to 84% have symptoms of other psychiatric disorders. We just said that. Relapsing condition. This is probably the most characteristic symptom of substance use disorder, other than the fact that it's characterized by using drugs. The other thing that it's characterized by is that it's a relapsing condition. Half of individuals leaving treatment relapse in their first year of recovery. And relapse is something that you will hear a lot about when you are talking about substance use disorder, because it's kind of definitionally a part of the disease. So substance use disorder typically is defined as continued use despite negative consequences, often with escalation and relapse despite efforts to maintain sobriety. It is also often accompanied by tolerance. So it's colloquially referred to as drug addiction, but in the literature, people now talk about it as substance use disorder, and they will, instead of saying somebody's a drug addict, it is much more common these days to say somebody with a substance use disorder, or somebody with drug addiction, or somebody with alcoholism, because while in certain communities, like in 12-step communities like Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous, those individuals do tend to find identifying as drug addicts empowering. People outside of those communities, when they refer to somebody as a drug addict or as an alcoholic or as a schizophrenic, it tends to minimize their humanity and kind of makes them look like a singular issue to the public, which is, oh, this person's just a drug addict. You know what I mean? So I'm not making a value judgment on whether or not you should use the drug addiction language, or if you should say substance use disorder, especially if you're somebody who has a history with substance use disorder. Obviously I'm not going to be policing what people are saying. I don't really care, but I'm just pointing out that in the literature, if you're looking in the 80s, 90s, definitely before that, but in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, it was very common for researchers to refer to drug addicts and drug addiction. And these days it's much more common to see substance use disorder and people with, alcoholism or drug addiction or whatever. And this is like this is like a pretty typical cycle of addiction that people will talk about, where there's a preoccupation or anticipation phase. That is followed by the binge intoxication phase, and then withdrawal and negative affect. So you should know about this cycle for the exam, and you should also know that the substance use disorder has a lot of familiarities and similar characteristics with other psychological pathologies like obsessive compulsive disorder or anxiety disorders, where individuals will have intrusive thoughts about their substance of interest. You know what I mean? So this preoccupation and anticipation phase is a buildup where the individual may be contemplating whether or not they're going to use drugs. And that can be in of itself extremely debilitating to people with substance use disorders, that they can ruminate about whether or not they should or should not try to get drugs today or get alcohol today. But ultimately there is a kind of like a feeling amongst individuals with this disorder that they're trying to make it so that they don't do it, but then there's a buildup of anticipation about doing it, and the higher that buildup gets, the anticipation of actually finally saying screw it, I'm just gonna go get a hit or whatever. It becomes harder and harder to ignore. People will also in this phase justify the use, so this is where the denial aspect of substance use disorder and drug addiction kind of rears its head, which is that, it wasn't that big of a deal. It's like, I just got one DUI, or, I didn't even have any real consequences. I mean, I'm having diarrhea today because I ate too much Sour Patch when I got too high, it's not that big of a deal. I'm just going to smoke one, I'm just going to hit the bong once, and or I'm just going to hit one dab, or I'm just going to hit, so there's this kind of justification, I'm not as bad as so-and-so, I'm not like my dad, he was homeless, I'm paying all my bills, etc. And as we're going to talk about the consequences of substance use disorder, but these are the kind of things where people will minimize consequences because there's, again, this negative construal of what a drug addict is, which is, drug addicts are those people without teeth that live under a bridge that smoke crack. That's a drug addict. If you are, a middle class individual living in a house smoking weed, you couldn't possibly be a drug addict, right? That's not what a drug addict is. That's not what it looks like. In fact, weed is like a plant, bro. It's totally non-addictive. It's only psychologically addictive, right? So these are things that people will say to themselves during this preoccupation and anticipation phase to justify and allow themselves to, kind of trick themselves into using. This then leads to a binge and intoxication phase where individuals tend to have difficulty regulating the amount that they consume. So while before the binge and intoxication phase, during the preoccupation and anticipation phase, they may have been discussing or talking to themselves about how they're only going to have one drink or one dab, or just one line, whatever it is, that tends to go out the window with this binge intoxication phase, almost definitionally so, because if somebody really was able just to have one of whatever it is, then likely they won't be having consequences, which would mean that they likely definitionally aren't drug addicts or substance use disorder having people. But the binge intoxication phase happens, which ultimately many times will lead to some kind of consequence. It could be a physiological consequence like cirrhosis. It could be injury that is secondary to getting loaded. It could be the case that the person got into a car accident or fell down, or it could be that they called somebody and kind of embarrassed themselves. It could be that they, I don't know, there's no end to the amount of trouble that somebody can get into during the binging intoxication phase. And binging looks a lot different in between individuals. I mean, some people, a binge for them might be 20 drinks. Other people, a binge for them might be, 5 drinks. It really is variable amongst the individuals, which is why it's kind of defined by the consequences, which we will again get into. And then there's a withdrawal or negative affect stage. And this tends to be where people, if it's an alcoholic or somebody with alcoholism and they wake up the next day and they literally just feel like they're going to die because of how withdrawn they are. And withdrawal is, basically a hangover is basically withdrawal, right? So they're hungover, they're vomiting, they are like can't see straight, they are having all these problems. They're like, I'm never going to drink again, but then they start feeling better in midday, and then the preoccupation anticipation cycle starts happening again, which then again leads to binge and then withdrawal. So there's kind of like this, I'm swearing off drugs and alcohol forever during this withdrawal or negative affect stage, but ultimately it will lead back to anticipation for the next binge. And this cycle can vary wildly amongst individuals. I mean, some people have this cycle on a daily basis. Some people have this cycle on a weekly or a monthly basis. I mean, individuals may only binge once a week or once a month. But it's not, a good measurement sometimes is the number of drinks that somebody has per week, or the number of hits, or the number of drunks or highs that people have per week. But it can, if somebody continues to if somebody only drinks once a month, but every time they drink they get a DUI, then that's a substance use disorder, almost definitionally, unfortunately, because they can't control themselves when they drink, and they continue to drink, and then they continue to get DUIs, right? So it's also extremely important to differentiate between a physiological dependence on a chemical and substance use disorder. They are not the same thing. And this is what the general public tends to get wrong about substance use disorder, is that they think that a physiological dependence is just definitionally substance use disorder. But that's not true. Any individual or animal can become dependent on a chemical. If you give somebody opioids every single day for enough time, they will become physically dependent. And that physiological dependence is defined by physical withdrawal when the chemical is taken away. So if you take somebody who has the least addictive personality on the planet and you put them in a hospital bed and you just IV drip them, morphine, they are going to be physiologically dependent on the opiate. Like, they will not be able to poop. They will have hyperanalgesic effects. They will have, when you take the drug away, they'll have diarrhea. They will have body aches and cold, flu-like symptoms. And that doesn't have anything to do with whether or not this person has a psychological disorder, right? That's completely physiological in nature. And physiological dependence often is associated with substance use disorder and drug addiction, but it doesn't have to be. Remember, I gave you an example just a second ago of somebody who only drinks once a month but always gets a DUI every time they do it. That person is likely not going to be physiologically dependent on alcohol. However, the fact that they have such a severe consequence is indicative of a substance use disorder. It doesn't mean that they 100% have it, but it's a very bad sign. So, and similarly, individuals who have substance use disorder may or may not be physiologically dependent on the chemical. Like I said, so some people who have a drug addiction are extremely physiologically dependent on a chemical. And this could manifest in DTs or delirium tremors in alcohol. It can manifest in, obviously, like I said, something as ridiculous as constipation in opioids, or with caffeine. You can be addicted to caffeine and have severe headaches when you stop drinking coffee. So I have some examples, here. There's another one: sleeping for abnormally long periods after coming off of stimulants. So stimulants are weird drugs because, and this kind of exemplifies the point. Stimulants don't have a real strong physiological hook to them. Cocaine, meth, these kinds of drugs, realistically, a lot of the time, the only withdrawal symptom you have from them is sleeping a long time. So it's not like with alcohol where you can literally die from withdrawal. And that's, something to point out about, our, when we talked about in our psychopharmacology, and I was harping on whether or not drugs are good or bad, it's like, well, I mean, the only legal drug that we have, that's not a controlled substance is alcohol. And that is like the only drug that I'm aware of that you can die from the withdrawal. You can also die from barbiturates, benzodiazepines, and other kind of central nervous system depressants like that, but you won't die from an opioid overdose or you will die from an opioid overdose, but you won't die from an opioid withdrawal. You won't die from a meth withdrawal. You certainly aren't going to die from withdrawal from weed, which does have withdrawal, by the way. But you can die from an alcohol withdrawal. So you oftentimes will need, like, it's kind of dangerous to withdraw from alcohol in a non medical setting, because you absolutely can die from that. Anything else here? So this will for sure be an exam question. Physiological dependence is not substance use disorder. Substance use disorder does not require physiological dependence. However, many people with a substance use disorder will have physiological dependence. And also, this is important to note, because once somebody is, quote unquote, clean or sober or no longer engaging in a substance use disorder, that doesn't mean that they don't have a substance use disorder, right? It doesn't mean that they can now, because they've been detoxed from opiates, that they're safe to go drink alcohol. Most people with a substance use disorder are addicted to multiple drugs. It's very rare that somebody is only addicted to one drug. So most people have a polysubstance use disorder, and if they are withdrawn and no longer have a physiological dependence, they will likely still meet criteria for a substance use disorder. So directly related to physiological dependence is tolerance, which we've talked about previously in the psychopharmacology lecture, but in a technical sense, tolerance is defined by a rightward shift in this dose response curve. So if you remember, this is a sigmoidal curve, which is showing a dose and response relationship. And as somebody becomes tolerant to drugs, then they will have to take more of that drug in order to get that same effect. So this is continued use of a drug resulting in a diminished effect with regular use of the same dose. It typically results in an escalation of use. So it doesn't have to result in escalation, but it often drives escalation, which I mean taking more, because the person who's doing the drugs likely is trying to get high, or is likely trying to have some kind of subjective effect of the drug. And since that is the case, they will take more and more of the drug to get the same, subjective experience that they were trying to get previously, or that they got previously. As I said, in a pharmacological technical sense, it's defined as a rightward shift in the dose response curve. So I may have said leftward shift before, I don't know, but it's a rightward shift. So basically it shifts over in this kind of graph, and that's because the dosaging increases here, and that's in order to get a similar response. So it also depends on learning. So this will be important for overdose, which is what we're about to talk about, but tolerance frequently is a very interesting phenomenon. Sensitization as well is interesting, but tolerance is very interesting in this context because it's obviously a physiological measurement, right? Like, how much drug do I need to take to have this effect? Respiratory depression, or it could be the hedonic effect of the drug. But interestingly, it is mediated by a psychological phenomenon, which is learning, right? So one thing that happens is that when you are engaging in repeated drug use, not always, but very often, individuals will be using drugs in a similar location. You know what I mean? Like, there's a chair that they open a beer and watch the game on. There is a room that they're, grinding coke on. You know what I mean? Like doing coke in a particular bathroom. People are, very frequently have rituals that are associated with substance use disorder. Obviously, this may be highly dependent on what level of economic support somebody has. I mean, if somebody is homeless, then they may be doing drugs in a variety of different locations, but that's not always the case. Sometimes they have a particular public restroom that they might use frequently, or they know a place that's not so aggro towards homeless people, so they'll go there to do drugs. But the point is that when you are constantly doing drugs in the same environment, as you learned from our learning and memory lecture, this produces a associative learning outcome where the environment signals to your body that you're about to ingest drugs. So what your body does is it tries to fight the exogenous effect. And the fact that the environment is signaling to your body that you're about to do drugs, your body starts to engage in compensatory mechanisms. I don't have this written down, but you will need to know this for the exam. These compensatory mechanisms are essentially your body's homeostatic defenses trying to keep you at a particular set point, right? So when you are doing opioids, one effect of opioid administration, as we talked about, is respiratory depression. So when you are in the environment where you're about to, shoot some dope or get high, your body will actively start fighting some of those physiological outcomes like respiratory depression. Now, this creates a very dangerous situation because individuals will be used to taking a certain amount of drug in their normal environment. Normally they'll take a certain amount of a particular dose, a certain amount of cc's, if they're shooting up or whatever. And they will think that they're safe with that dose. But if they use, and they normally would be safe with that dose, but if they use in an environment that they're not used to, then sometimes they will be at a much higher likelihood of an overdose because they haven't they haven't given their body those cues to essentially start engaging in those homeostatic defense mechanisms. Now, that's not always the case because there are other cues like the paraphernalia itself, but respiratory depression and death due to respiratory depression frequently happens when people are using drugs outside of the context that they're used to using them in. So that's just kind of like a through line of this course, which is that your psychology affects your biology and your biology affects your psychology, right? I mean, as a neuroscientist, I'm going to just say that your psychology is produced from your biology, but you'll have psychologists who will argue that psychology itself is a emergent phenomenon that can't just be reduced to biology. But regardless, though, this is just an example of learning mechanisms completely affecting what would seem to be a totally physiological outcome. So an overdose is not dying from drugs or even necessarily having a negative outcome with drugs. An overdose literally is just taking a higher dose than is prescribed or necessary. So if you're supposed to take 300 milligrams of a particular drug and you take 600, you've technically overdosed, right? Now, colloquially speaking, an overdose is referring, like if you say, Bo overdosed, then you're probably meaning that I either died or wound up in the hospital or something because I took too much drug. But an overdose is just taking a higher dose than is prescribed or necessary, although it is typically associated with death or something like that. So substance use disorder is defined by consequences. Therefore, you can have somebody who's doing illicit drugs, meaning illegal drugs, every day and not necessarily have a substance use disorder. So just doing an illicit drug does not mean that you are a drug addict. If you do heroin, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have a heroin use disorder. Now, I will say that it is very unlikely that somebody is doing heroin recreationally, okay? But as I made it pretty clear in the Psychopharm lecture, I don't think that drugs are bad. I think that drugs are just chemicals and people may or may not misuse those chemicals. So somebody, Carl Hart is a researcher at Columbia who argues vehemently against the notion that addiction is a brain disease. So I would encourage you all to go look at Carl Hart's work and maybe read his books or whatever. I disagree with Carl Hart, by the way, like vehemently, but he is one of the very few reputable sources that is skeptical about drug addiction being a brain disease, which is essentially how we look at it today in contemporary neuroscience. So Carl Hart at Columbia, go ahead and look him up. But yeah, just because you've done heroin, or just because you do cocaine, or just because you do DMT, it doesn't necessarily mean that you are that you have a drug addiction. Drug addiction is defined by consequences, and consequences may be internal or external. So some internal consequences could be depression or anhedonia, anxiety, feelings of worthlessness, and just general depression. Isolation when the individual would rather not be. So self-imposed isolation, right? So you have sometimes people, it's pretty common that people with drug addiction will isolate from other people because other people judge them for doing drugs, right? So it's like, if you have a substance use disorder, it can be difficult to diagnose substance use disorder because there's a lot of lying and denial that goes along with it. So, but I will tell you that it's a bad sign if you are somebody that's using in private. If you smoke a blunt with your buddies, but then you go home and like you dab all night and you're getting, you're smoking way more weed privately than you do publicly, that may be a bad sign. This is something that people that are alcoholic do all the time. They will drink a certain amount in front of other people, but then they may secretly drink as well, go to the bathroom, take a shot or whatever. Or when somebody leaves the table, they'll drink an additional shot. And so the people that they're with may think that they've only had 2 or 3 beers, but maybe they've actually had like 6 or 8 drinks. And what will happen sometimes is that people, in order to avoid this kind of judgment from their friends and family who may be, well-intentioned, but making them feel judged nonetheless, they will use alone because they run out of individuals who want to use like they do. Denial of a problem is a very bad sign for substance use disorder. So individuals will frequently, as I've already talked about, minimize the consequences. I think that this is common in all substance use disorders, but I think it's very common with people that have a substance use disorder with weed, and that's because people generally think of weed as not having, THC being the active ingredient, not having a physiological dependence mechanism to them or to it, and thinking that essentially, weed is not addictive. That's just not true. Weed absolutely is addictive for people that are drug addicts. You know what I mean? Like if somebody is prone to drug addiction, then they absolutely can and will become addicted to weed. You hear people talking about weed like they literally love weed. Like they like it's just you hear when you hear people talking about this plant, like it's a person. That's kind of a bad sign. But also it's because a lot of times the consequences of smoking weed are pretty minimal, right? Like it's not as destructive initially as alcohol or opioids or stimulants are. So what this results in is that people who are addicted to weed will have consequences like they can't eat unless they're high. That is a very, very common red flag of somebody who has a pretty severe cannabis addiction, which is that they cannot eat unless they're high. They cannot sleep unless they smoke. They don't really enjoy, honestly, doing anything unless they smoke. This is a severe consequence because what happens is that when people can't get high, normally it's not a consequence because it's fairly affordable and because you can pretty much function throughout the day being like pretty stoned once you're somebody who's a heavy cannabis user. But you'll notice that individuals with a cannabis use disorder become extremely angry and agitated when they can't smoke, which is a terrible sign. They have a lot of agitation, anxiety, and depression also that is brought on once they are no longer able to smoke. So these are all the kind of the internal consequences. External consequences are much harder to ignore and tend to be, people tend to remind you about them constantly. if you're somebody who has a lot of external consequences like legal issues, physical injury or disease, obviously cirrhosis, but getting hepatitis from sharing needles, or having a lung disorder, or falling downstairs. Like, people just find ways to injure themselves when they're high and drunk all the time. And then again, social isolation is also an external consequence. So we have self-imposed social isolation with this internal consequence where people are like, I don't want to drink in front of somebody when they're just going to make me feel bad about it. But then you also have situations where people just don't want to be around you anymore because you're such a pain in the ass when you're getting drunk all the time and throwing up in their toilets or their sinks or their bedrooms or their closets. You know what I mean? It's like people are just find ways to vomit in just about everything. You find a way to vomit into somebody's boot while they're still wearing it if you try hard enough. So, this is something where somebody's like, well, I don't really want to be around you anymore. So that can be an external consequence. So theoretically, even though I've gone through painstaking, I've explained all the ways that you may actually be somebody with a substance use disorder, even though you may not think you are. Theoretically, if an individual is doing a highly addictive drug every single day but has no internal or external consequences, they will not meet the criteria for a substance use disorder, because substance use disorder is defined by consequences. Okay, so if somebody is doing heroin, shooting heroin every day, and they genuinely don't have any of these problems, which basically only they can know for sure. You know what I mean? Like, only the individual themselves can know whether or not they want to die when they're not high. But it is technically possible. I think it's highly unlikely that you can do addictive drugs on a daily basis and not develop a problem, but it is technically possible. And I think that I have known individuals that may not actually have had a substance use disorder, even though they were doing things that seemed really sketchy. Carl Hart, as I already pointed out, suggests that he uses heroin on a regular basis and is not addicted to it and doesn't have any problems. I don't know, man. I wouldn't suggest doing heroin, but if you're somebody who wants to recreationally do meth or smoke coke, as I've said previously, I think that adults should be allowed to do whatever they want. So we're now going to get into the biology of addiction. And there are three main hypotheses of the neuroscience of addiction, which is the dopamine hypothesis, the glutamate hypothesis, and the dark side of addiction, or the opponent process theory of addiction. So we'll first start off with just the basic physiology, which is that all drugs of abuse, now this will become controversial. I'm just making the initial argument here, which is that it seems to be the case that all drugs of abuse increase dopaminergic release in the mesolimbocortical pathway. So we've already talked about this reward pathway a couple times. You will need to know what this pathway is specifically. Mesolimbocortical pathway is referring to the ventral tegmental area, projecting to the nucleus accumbens, or the limbic system, and the prefrontal cortex. Okay, so the prefrontal cortex sends communicates with the nucleus accumbens, and the nucleus accumbens communicates with the ventral tegmental area, and the ventral tegmental area communicates with both of them. So you'll need to know that if we're referring to the mesolimbocortical reward pathway, what we're saying is the VTA to nucleus accumbens and to the prefrontal cortex dopamine pathway. And this is thought to be the reward pathway that makes drugs reinforcing or rewarding, rather. So dopamine is produced in the ventral tegmental area and sends projections to the nucleus accumbens as well as the PFC. That's what I just said. All drugs of abuse increase dopaminergic tone in this pathway, albeit through a variety of mechanisms. So this is where it may get a little controversial. You have a lot of drugs that just directly increase dopaminergic release, like cocaine. Well, they block reuptake of it, right? But that ultimately increases dopamine in the cleft. So we have cocaine, which is blocking dopamine reuptake. We obviously have meth, which is reversing dopamine transporters and blocking reuptake. We have drugs like ecstasy, which also do that with dopamine, but also do it with serotonin. So it is widely believed that the reinforcing effects of all drugs of abuse are mediated through this mechanism of increasing dopamine. But you have other drugs like alcohol, cannabis, opioids, which Many individuals do have an increase in dopamine when they do these drugs, but they don't directly increase dopamine in this pathway. So that's where this gets a little bit controversial, is that the canonical view, meaning that the view that's been held for literally like the last 30 years, is that drug addiction or drugs of abuse are reinforcing because of dopamine release in this pathway. But a lot of the literature on substance use disorder in animal models is through use of like cocaine and meth. And that's because it's really easy to train rats to self-administer cocaine or meth. It's a little bit harder to get them to drink alcohol or to do, it's not hard to teach them to do opioids either, but a lot of that early literature was done on cocaine. So the central tenet of the dopamine hypothesis is that increased dopamine release is a primary consequence of and motivator in drug use. So that is the primary idea, is that we're doing drugs because of this because they feel good, and the reason that they feel good is because of this release of dopamine. Also, this is the nigrostriatal pathway, which is another dopamine pathway, which is important for movement and in some ways motivation, but this is the substantia nigra to the striatum. So kind of reinforcing this hypothesis is that in the 50s, it was discovered that rats will intracranially self-stimulate certain pleasure centers. And it was later discovered in the 80s that rats would specifically stimulate dopamine centers in the brain. So literally, and this is still done today, you can implant, and Carl Hart actually did some of this research himself, which is why he's such an interesting kind of rebellious figure in the addiction world. But you can implant an electrode into the VTA, and rats will press a lever to stimulate that nuclei with just this little electrode. Literally, they will go up there, and it's positive reinforcement. They seem to very much like it, and will continue to press it just for the dopamine release. So that's where a lot of this kind of evidence comes from, that it's the dopaminergic properties of drugs of abuse that is causing people to want to do them, is because, at least in rodents, the direct activation of dopamine is extremely reinforcing and rewarding. So the related to the dopamine hypothesis is that it is a disorder of learning and memory. So drug addiction is thought to arise from dysfunctional reward-related learning and memory formation. Drug-related reward learning and seeking are similar to natural rewards and stimulate similar neurobiological circuitry, which is an increase in extracellular dopamine in the nucleus accumbens. So, even when you're doing, when you're eating something like a fruit roll-up or like something tasty, you still get dopamine release in the mesolimbocortical circuitry, right? It's not just that this only happens with drugs of abuse. The thing is that the hypothesis is that there's a lot more dopaminergic release from the VTA to the PFC and the NAC compared to natural reinforcers. Additionally, there is a pretty big difference between how this dopamine is released in natural reinforcers compared to drugs of abuse, because the drugs of abuse directly stimulate the release. So if you're doing coke, the drug gets into your brain and directly, immediately activates the increase in dopamine, versus when you have a release in dopamine from a natural reinforcer, quote unquote, it is because, it first has to go through some sensory pathway. You know what I mean? Like it has to, in the instance of this, little fruit that this guy's eating, first it has to stimulate the sugar, the sweet taste receptors. The sugar needs to bind to a sweet taste receptor and activate that sweet taste receptor, which then needs to transfer, through transduction, like we talked about in sensation and perception. It needs to get through the peripheral nervous system to eventually increase dopaminergic release in those brain regions that we talked about, the VTA and the PFC and the NAC. So there's, inherently a difference between the onset of the effect and the amount of dopamine that's being released in these scenarios. And so the idea is that there are long-term changes in the prefrontal cortex and the nucleus accumbens that contributes to dysfunctional learning and relapse, and ultimately something called incubation of craving. So the idea with the dopamine hypothesis and this adjacent hypothesis, which is that it's got to do with learning and memory, is that drugs of abuse directly stimulate these dopaminergic pathways, and they do so in a manner that is far more intense than natural reinforcers. So dopamine itself is likely rewarding because we've already shown that the rats will self-stimulate dopaminergic brain regions intracranially, but dopamine is an important neurotransmitter to signal a salient event also. So it's not just that dopamine itself is reinforcing, but when you have something that is reinforcing, like watching TikTok, you get a release of dopamine, right? So, and that release of dopamine is making us happy, or it is this something else that's making us happy. It's a little bit nebulous as to what exactly the relationship is here. But ultimately what will happen for sure is that you will get a positive association between your phone, TikTok, and like this emotionally salient event that you had, right? So it's like you have TikTok, you're scrolling, you're enjoying this. This enjoyment is releasing, or the motivation to seek the enjoyment is releasing dopamine. This is then becoming associated with your phone, and now your phone is starting to more or less represent the good feelings that you get from watching TikTok, right? So this is just classical conditioning that we already went over in reward learning to memory, or in the learning memory lecture. But the point is that dopamine is not just reinforcing, but it's also telling your biology, hey, this is a good thing that's happening. And if you don't get the dopamine, like if you actually are engaging in the behavior, but you're not getting the reinforcer. So let's say that you go on TikTok and your internet's not working. So you keep scrolling, but it's not loading new videos. Then this actually will result in a major decrease in dopaminergic release, right? So same thing happens with drugs. Maybe you are thinking that you're smoking crack, but you're really smoking, some of those little popcorn things from the ceiling that you found in the carpet, and you go to hit it, and you're initially getting a release of dopamine because you see the paraphernalia, like you're doing the same behavior that's associated with it. This is going to cause dopamine release in of itself, but once you actually inhale the smoke, and the chemical, which is the cocaine, is not actually in that event, now you're going to get a severe reduction in dopaminergic release, which is going to indicate to you that something wrong is happening. So it's kind of an error. It's an error signaler as well. So, like I already said, related to the dopamine hypothesis is the learning hypothesis of substance use disorder, and this is also called the incentive salience hypothesis of addiction. So the idea here is that hyperdopaminergic activation results in aberrant sensitization. Aberrant just means like dysfunctional sensitization of neurological symptoms, providing increased salience to drugs associated cues and substance consumption, leading to increased craving despite a decreased liking of the substance. So this idea here is that what's happening is that you're getting this activation of the mesolimbic circuitry that is telling your brain, hey, whatever it is you're doing, this is awesome, keep doing it, right? This then starts to cause adaptations in your brain that results in an increased motivational drive. That's what the sensitization part is talking about. That there's a sensitization of the drive to seek the drugs, right? But as we already talked about, tolerance is going to also be engaged while you're doing drugs. So while you're becoming sensitized, or your desire for the drug is increasing, your enjoyment of the drug is decreasing, right? So you take one bong toke initially, and that makes you feel super good, and you're like, this is dope, I'm gonna keep doing this. In the future, you taking a bong toke, but you don't get as high as you used to because of tolerance. So you take more and more bong tokes to get to the level of high that you're used to. But as you're becoming tolerant to the hedonic effects of the drug, you are becoming sensitized to the desire for the drug. So you'll 100% need to know about this on the quiz and the exam. I will ask what the incentive salience hypothesis of addiction is, and it is the tolerance to the hedonic effects of the drug, but the sensitization of the taking of the drug. So the theory posits that while the user becomes tolerant to certain aspects of the drug, which is the hedonic effects, they become sensitized to other aspects of the drug, which is the craving. This starts a cycle of taking more and more drug to try to recapture prior hedonic or rewarding value, while ever increasing the desire to use the drug. So here, we had just have this isn't real data, but just some example of that over time, desire to take the drug increases. And obviously, we all have heard stories of people neglecting their kids to do drugs. And the idea is that essentially over time, the desire to use drugs supersedes the desire for basic necessities. Taking care of your hygiene, taking care of your children, taking care of your legal obligations, or obviously your work obligations. You start to desire to do the drug more than you desire to keep your job, basically. So another aspect of this theory is called the incubation of craving. And what this theory is positing is that as you have days in withdrawal, your desire to use increases. So this is what we were talking about in that initial cycle of addiction, which is that there's this anticipation phase of use. And the idea is that as you get further and further away from using drugs, your anticipation of using increases. And this is true also of like sugar and rodent models, but basically you can show with rats that you can increase subsequent use by increasing days in withdrawal from the drug. And it's not just drug, like I said, also is a phenomenon that happens with sugar too. So this has some particular consequences when people are trying to abstain from use. Now, it's unclear at what point this increased anticipation starts going away, because obviously there are individuals who have been clean or sober or not used their drug of choice for years at a time. I mean, if you go to 12-step meetings like Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous, you'll see individuals there who haven't used drugs in, 1, 5, 10, 15, 20, 45 plus years. So obviously there is some point or ability for individuals to no longer deal with this craving that is that they can't ignore. Like there is some way that people find to no longer be driven by this incubation of craving or this desire to use. We'll talk about this in the treatment methodologies for substance use disorder, but it's unclear as to why that happens. And this is called spontaneous recovery. And it happens both in and out of treatment communities. So I'm not going to comment on whether or not 12-step groups are or are not effective. I don't know the actual statistics on this, but I do know that there are people that are sober for decades, both in and out of 12-step programs. So there are some problems, as I've been alluding to, with the dopamine hypothesis of addiction, and I really think that everybody needs to read. If you have any interest at all in the neuroscience of addiction, if you start doing any research in this realm, you need to get familiar with David Nutt, who is a professor, a researcher, and he has a really interesting paper called The Dopamine Theory of Addiction, 40 Years of High and Lows, where he kind of goes over some of the controversy. So the vast majority, so what the first thing that I've already kind of alluded to is that the vast majority of the research that drives this theory was done in rats with stimulant drugs that directly increase dopamine, like cocaine and meth. So a lot of the preclinical theories like the glutamate homeostasis hypothesis of addiction, by the way, which we're about to go over, and the dopamine hypothesis, which we've already went over, was kind of derived from rodent models of, cocaine substance use disorder. And this is where some of the critique that Carl Hart has for the field as well. But anyway, so that's the first issue. The other issue is that it's unclear whether or not alcohol, ketamine, and cannabis increase dopamine release in humans. So as I said, all drugs of abuse increase this mesolimbic dopamine release, right? Well, in humans, it's not as clear as it is in rodent models. So association between increase in striatal dopamine release and hedonic effects was less apparent. So when they did see an increase in striatal dopaminergic release, it wasn't clear that this was just associated with the rewarding valence of the drug. And intravenous methylphenidate increases dopamine higher than drugs mentioned above, but is not considered a drug of abuse, right? So so this is also just a critique about the hypothesis, which is that, well, if it's the case that you just need to increase mesolimbic dopamine and mesolimbocortical dopamine, then why would it be the case that you have a drug like methylphenidate, which is Ritalin, which most people don't want to abuse? You know what I mean? Like, if you've ever talked to somebody whose drug of choice is stimulants, and you ask them what they think about Ritalin, they will not oftentimes have a fond memory of abusing Ritalin. Most people don't abuse Ritalin, but sometimes people will if that's all they can get their hands on. But Adderall, on the other hand, has a much more rewarding aspect to it than Ritalin. I've heard people that have an addiction to stimulants say that Ritalin is like all the bad parts of stimulants and none of the good parts. You know what I mean? So there is this idea that, like, well, if it's the case that what makes a drug reinforcing or rewarding is mesolimbocortical circuitry, then how does a drug that directly acts on that not cause the rewarding or hedonic effects? Additionally, blocking dopamine receptors does not seem to reduce opiate reward. So when you give people dopaminergic antagonists, they still enjoy opiates. Striatal dopamine release does not seem to be associated with opioid dependence. And anticipation of heroin reward in the absence of heroin administration was not associated with dopamine release. And this is all in humans. So David Nutt points these things out that, while it may be the case that dopaminergic activity is extremely important in certain substance use disorders, like with cocaine or methamphetamine or whatever, that it may not be as important with other drugs like cocaine or opioids or cannabis, for example. However, I will say that the vast majority of the addiction world believes that dopaminergic release is the primary driver of substance use disorder, and reward. So I'll just go ahead and put that there. Additionally, here's another point, which is that if dopamine is the problem with drugs and substance use disorder, then where are the treatments? We have plenty of compounds that reduce or increase dopamine, right? So, I mean, it's like, I'm not coming down either way on this. I don't know. I think that David Nutt has a really good argument against the dopamine hypothesis. But I don't know. But I don't know what the truth is, whether or not it is actually, if dopamine is really the driver. It's a hypothesis. There's a lot of evidence for it, and there is some very important caveats to pay attention to with this hypothesis. So we've already talked a lot about glutamate. It's a non-essential amino acid. It's the most abundant excitatory neurotransmitter in the mammalian nervous system. It plays a role in a variety of mechanisms, including in the periphery with the pancreas, the gut, and taste buds. It is the precursor to GABA. It's necessary for healthy functioning of the nervous system. And dysregulation with glutamate is associated with several neuropsychiatric diseases. Gone over with schizophrenia, for instance. And hypofunctionality of NMDA receptors produces learning and memory deficits. And NMDA receptors are important for cognitive flexibility and are necessary for long-term potentiation, which we went over previously as one of the cellular mechanisms of learning. So, I mean, it fits with the dopamine hypothesis in that dysfunctional glutamate signaling could also result in learning abnormalities, for instance. Okay, so the glutamate homeostasis hypothesis is the idea that chronic use of drugs results in a dysregulation of glutamate homeostasis, resulting in the reduction in cortical control, and in the context of SUD, relapse and drug seeking. So the idea is that you have chronic drugs of abuse, the use of those rather, and this results in a decrease in basal glutamate in the nucleus accumbens. And so basal glutamate is just meaning at rest. This also increases Q or drug-induced glutamate release from the prefrontal cortex, and this is due to that aberrant learning that we talked about previously. Loss of control when primed with cues of, this results in a loss of control when primed with cues or drugs. So essentially, people are walking around with deficient glutamate. Then when they see something that reminds them of the drug, then this results in pathological increase of glutamatergic, innervation to the VTA or to the nucleus accumbens, which then results in ultimately pathological thinking and behaviors associated with that drug of abuse. So this mechanism I have actually reduced its complexity quite a bit, so you will need to know this mechanism on the exam. I'm not exactly sure how I'm going to ask about it quite yet, but I am going to ask about this mechanism. So essentially this first neuron here is showing prefrontal cortical increase in dopamine, and this is due to maybe taking methamphetamine, which is reversing transporters, or taking cocaine, which is blocking reuptake of dopamine. And this results in an increased release of glutamate to the nucleus accumbens. So what happens here is that you have two very important proteins that are floating around on neurons and glia in the nucleus accumbens. And one of them is called XCT. And so XCT is actually a glutamate antiporter. So what it's doing is it actually removes cysteine from the extracellular cleft, which you don't need to know about, and it puts glutamate into the extracellular space. So XCT is this transporter that in normal circumstances is actually helping maintain levels of basal glutamate in the nucleus accumbens. So it's kind of like the sodium-potassium pump. It is, removing one chemical from the extracellular space, which in this case is cysteine, but I'm not going to ask you about that. And it is putting glutamate into the extracellular space. So we also have GLT1, which is the glutamate transporter, which obviously, like dopamine transporters and serotonin transporters, are removing glutamate from the synaptic cleft, right? So we have one protein that is helping maintain glutamate levels at rest, and we have another protein that is helping to clear excess glutamate when we have glutamatergic release, right? So what happens is that glutamate is releasing in such high quantities from activation of the prefrontal cortex to the nucleus accumbens that then homeostatic mechanisms are basically saying, well, we have a lot of glutamate, so we don't need XCT, so we're going to downregulate XCT. This fallout results in, at rest, a reduction in GLT1, because basically, since XCT, this transporter, this glutamate antiporter, is not producing sufficient glutamate at rest, that is basically telling the glutamate transporter proteins that they don't need to be around. So what happens is that glutamate's released in such high amounts that XCT is downregulated. It's internalized back into the membrane, right? And then what happens is subsequently, now outside of the context of drugs, is that GLT1 is also removed from, is also downregulated because there's not enough glutamate to even suck back up to need a glutamate transporter. So then what happens is that there is not enough glutamate at rest because XCT is gone or downregulated. It's still there, but it's just not there in sufficient quantities to have a correct amount of glutamate in the extracellular space. And then also, once we get another hit of glutamatergic release from the prefrontal cortex, GLT1 isn't around to reuptake that glutamate, which means that you're getting a lot of activity of glutamate, a lot of glutamate activity rather, which could explain the pathological compulsive nature of substance use disorder. So let's see what I have written here, is that overstimulation of glutamate from the PFC downregulates the glutamate antiporter, XCT, and the nucleus accumbens, which is what I just said. And this downregulation of XCT results in less basal glutamate. So we don't have the antiporter that's supposed to be monitoring these levels, which then results in a downregulation of GLT1, which is the primary mechanism to get glutamate out of the cleft. Thus, when another large release of glutamate comes from the PFC, the problem is compounded, right? So then it's like you get this, you do coke or whatever drug it is, and then we get a huge release of glutamate again, which further compounds the issue because it says, okay, well, we have all this glutamate, we don't need an antiporter right now to be monitoring this, so it's downregulated, and then we have a further problem of downregulation of GLT1 because of the fact that there is not enough basal glutamate floating around, right? So this is a mechanism, this is a very interesting mechanism that, again, holds true in many neuroscientific concepts and kind of brings together a lot of issues, right? Which is that we have tolerance being indicated here because of the reduction in the transporters, which, tolerance can be mediated by a lot of physiological effects, and downregulation of receptors is one of them. You know what I mean? So you are less tolerant to the drug because you have less receptors that are sensitive to that drug, for instance. So this concept of too much excitation, decreasing an antiporter, and then ultimately decreasing a transporter results in too much glutamatergic release. So it sounds counterintuitive, but too much glutamate results in a reduction in basal glutamate, which results in a decreasing glutamate transporters to get rid of excess glutamate, so that when we get another huge influx of glutamate, it hangs around too long in the cleft and causes problems. Okay, so this is the ultimate, hypothesis, the glutamate hypothesis as to what's driving intrusive thoughts and impulsivity. And it's important to note that this pathological glutamate release is also thought to happen in the context of just the cues, right? So it's not just that you're getting this release with when they're actually doing the drug, but also when the cues are happening. Okay, so allostasis, we've already talked about in the homeostasis lecture, and it's more or less the same here in this hypothesis. So this is the dark side of addiction, or it's also called the opponent process theory of addiction. So let's just go ahead and define allostasis in this context. This is stability through change, right? So meaning that the body is trying to maintain a particular level or set point by changing behavioral outputs to maintain that, or physiological outputs. Allostasis refers particularly to the idea that parameters of most physiological regulatory systems change to accommodate environmental demands. Although allostatic processes are critical for adaptive functioning, chronic or repeated activation of physiological symptoms in response to life's challenges is hypothesized to exact a toll on such systems. So the idea is that the physiological response to environmental stressors has a limit, more or less. And although the physiological response will try to constantly react and prevent change that is being forced by the environment, it's not a perfect system and it can break. The allostasis theory of drug addiction is that drug addiction is at least in part due to the body adapting to chronic administration of exogenous chemicals by constantly producing a new, often lower physiological set point. So if you remember when I was talking about tolerance just earlier in this lecture, and the idea that, when you're taking an opiate and you're causing a respiratory depression event, your body is going to try to fight that respiratory depression. But when the body is trying to fight certain chemical release events that may be hedonic in nature, like the potential release of dopamine or glutamate or something like that, then the body's physiological response to those stressors may result in the individual having a negative affective state, for instance. So I hope that makes sense, right? So it's like you can imagine that some of these effects are a little bit more easy to kind of like wrap your head around. It makes sense that if you're going to take an exogenous chemical that makes it so you stop breathing, that your body is going to increase respiration in anticipation of that chemical being ingested, right? But this is going to be true of many physiological systems in the body, including those physiological systems that may mediate your affective state or your emotional state. So, this is not unique to the dark side of addiction. The dark side of addiction is a specific theory by someone named George Koob, but it is based off of these two, parent theories of allostasis and the opponent process theory. So this is a very common chart of opponent process theory in psychology, which is that when you have some kind of stimulus that causes an effect on your body. In this case, we're talking about drugs, but it doesn't have to be. It could be, like the first time you held your partner's hand or whatever, right? Like there's going to be a reaction, in this graph, it's talking about your emotional response or your affective state, but it could be true of a variety of physiological systems. But there's going to be an increase in your affective response the first time you do drugs or the first time you touch your partner's hand or whatever. But then there's going to be, and that's called this first time that you're touching your partner's hand or you're doing drugs and you have that increase in your emotional state or your affective state, that's called the A process. Okay, so that's like the drug is doing something to your physiology, or maybe your anticipation of touching your partner's hand or whatever is doing something to your physiology that's causing you to be excited or happy or whatever, and that is causing an increase in your emotional state. But then there's going to be a B process where your body is trying to bring you back to a set point, right? So that B process then causes a reduction in the mood. And essentially this sub panel here is showing that the A process, like your actual outcome of this little line here of like a spike in behavior followed by a short reduction and then an even greater reduction in your emotional state below baseline. So the baseline is this line here at 0, right? So you're at 0, no emotion, you get excited, then it comes down a little bit, and then there's a plummet that goes below the baseline, and then eventually you recover. That's like the idea here. Is that this is the outcome of your A process subtracting your B process. So if you were to have just the A process, the curve would look like this, where you're at baseline, you get super excited, and you remain excited until you have like a huge dip in your emotional response back to baseline, but you never go below that baseline. So the idea here is that the actual experience is the summation of the A process minus the B process, right? The reduction, taking B from A gives you your ultimate outcome here. So I hope that makes sense, which is that you have like a theoretical increase in emotional response, which is A. You have a theoretical opponent process, which is a reduction, your body fighting this increase, and that's the B response, and what you actually get is A minus B. But the idea is that after many stimulations of this, after many drug experiences, the B process begins sooner and becomes stronger. The B process becomes has a greater onset and becomes stronger, such that your actual elevation in emotional response is very low. It's barely above baseline, but you still have to deal with the depression or the negative affective crash that happens after the drug wears off. Okay, so this is the idea that substance use disorder is primarily driven by negative reinforcement. Okay. So when you're non-dependent or naive to drugs and you take a drug, you get a release of dopamine, you get a release of opioid peptides, an increase of GABA and glutamate, but your body is trying to fight this increase in these positive affective peptides and neurotransmitters by increasing corticotropin releasing factor, norepinephrine, dynorphin, and NPY. And ultimately, you kind of come back to baseline and dip below baseline a little bit due to this increase in stress hormones and stress neurotransmitters. Once you become dependent, though, your baseline has shifted. Okay, so essentially the idea is that once people become addicted to the drug, their normal is now below their previous baseline. And although when they do the drugs, they do go above their previous baseline, it's just barely above that baseline. And we have a sensitization and a subsequent decrease, sensitization of the stress hormones, but a decrease in the overall release of the neurotransmitters and hormones that are causing the increase in your affective state. And this is true also people that are periodically using. So this dependent episodic drug taking binges during withdrawal is that like you're in a withdrawal state when you're really coming off of a binge, is that you don't even reach essentially baseline. So your new normal is far below the original baseline that you had. And when you get high, you go above your previous, like this zero prime, change in your baseline. But ultimately, you never even, when you get high, you never even get back to where you were previously. Now, when you're in protracted abstinence or you relapse, the idea is that you are still below your normal baseline. But as you can see, this curve is much higher than it was during the episodic drug binges withdrawal and the continuous drug taking to avoid withdrawal. So let's go and see what I have written here. This theory posits that the individual's baseline hedonic affective state continues to decline over repeated abuse. That makes sense. And that the motivating factor ends up being negative reinforcement, which is that you're taking drugs to alleviate the aversive state that you're in rather than taking drugs for the reward they provide. If the individual achieves some period of abstinence and relapse, the B process is much more aggressive than it originally was. So the main difference between this theory and the previous ones is that this is primarily a theory that revolves around negative reinforcement, which is that individuals continue to use drugs because they're trying to not feel bad rather than using drugs because that makes them feel good, right? So they are still, in some sense it is because it's making them feel good, but ultimately when we say feel good, we're talking about being high, which is up here, whereas these individuals are really just feeling normal, So like most psychiatric disorders, the true nature of substance use disorder is unknown, and it is likely a multifactorial disease state which uses, multiple of these theories. It probably has something to do with the glutamate homeostasis hypothesis and the dopamine hypothesis and the negative reinforcement of, the opponent process theory. And each of these neuroscientific perspectives explains different aspects of the disease state. So it's like with the dopamine hypothesis, we can explain why people initially start doing drugs and why they continue to do drugs. Is because it's fun, it feels good, it's positive reinforcement. The glutamate homeostasis hypothesis essentially explains the relapsing and intrusive thoughts that are associated with substance use disorder and maybe even why people relapse after being abstinent for some period of time. And then The Dark Side of Addiction by George Koob is trying to explain, why people may get so helplessly kind of hooked. It's because they're desperate to avoid the negative feelings and the negative psychological stress as well as the negative physiological stress that they experience from chronic drug use. So how about treatment? Is there any hope? Well, there are several types of treatment for substance use disorder. There is replacement therapy, which is essentially saying that you're going to take, we only have treatments for certain drugs, right? So, and ultimately, I would argue that we don't really have a good treatment at all for substance use disorder because most people are not just addicted to opioids. Most people are not just addicted to nicotine. Most people have polysubstance use disorder, which is that they're, drinking alcoholically and they're doing coke on top of it, and we don't have a really great pharmacological treatments for, polysubstance use disorder. But nonetheless, they do have replacement therapy like Suboxone and Methadone, which I'm going to explain the mechanism of action momentarily. But basically, these treatments are kind of giving up on the idea of abstinence, right? So, or at least temporarily. I'll explain about it in the 12-step part that I'm about to talk about. But, like 12-step or behavioral treatments oftentimes will advocate for complete abstinence from drugs. And Suboxone and methadone treatment is essentially replacement therapy for less harmful drugs. So it's a form of harm reduction. We also have some drugs that are like positive punishment, like antabuse. And what this drug does is that it reduces the ability to metabolize a certain product of alcohol that makes you sick. So what the result is that you essentially become violently ill whenever you drink. And then there's antagonist maintenance therapy, like with naltrexone, which is a opioid antagonist. So you take this in a shot, and it has like a slow, sustained release over time, and you can't get high on opioids when you have this. So here are basically some of the different methods and mechanisms here. Suboxone is called buprenorphine. And you can see that it's a partial agonist, and it also has naloxone mixed with it. So naloxone is an acute treatment for opioid overdose. It's a full opioid antagonist, and it will push you into something called precipitated withdrawal, which is essentially where you are fully physiologically dependent on morphine or some kind of opioid rather. And if you were to take naloxone, then it would precipitate withdrawal. It would make it so you immediately go into a withdrawal state because it kicks off all of the opioids that are currently bound to opioid receptors. So buprenorphine is mixed with naloxone and a partial agonist, opioid agonist. And what this results in is that since it's a partial agonist, you can only get so high. You can't get as high as you normally would with heroin or fentanyl or something like that. So it allows people to kind of scratch that itch without having the potential dangerous respiratory side effects that come from using their likely drug of abuse of choice. It also has naloxone in it because this makes it so you can't abuse it you can't shoot it up, because naloxone, if you shoot it up, it will essentially put you in a precipitated withdrawal, or at the very least, if you're not physiologically dependent, it will simply make it so you are not able to get high from the buprenorphine. However, buprenorphine often comes in a sublingual administration methodology, so it's like kind of like one of those little what are the breath strips, like Listerine breath mouth strips, whatever, and you kind of put that underneath your tongue, and then it releases it acts sublingually, so then you can get the buprenorphine, but naloxone has very little effect when it's administered through the periphery like that. So you can get these partial agonist effects from the buprenorphine, but you can't inject it IV because it won't do anything because of the naloxone. And then there's also methadone, which is the other replacement therapy, which binds to the opioid receptor, and it's a full opioid agonist, right? But its effects are not as strong as heroin, and it lasts a lot longer than heroin does. So you can't do methadone and then shoot heroin or fentanyl, because it's not going to, well, actually, I don't know about fentanyl, to be honest, but for sure, at least for heroin, it's the affinity for the opioid receptor of methadone is higher than the affinity of heroin for that. So it's going to stay bound to the receptor longer, and so the heroin won't have any effect, essentially. And then this is just naltrexone. It's just a mu opioid receptor antagonist, like I already said. So if you are on naltrexone treatment, then you essentially are unable to get high off of opioids. So those are the pharmacological treatments for substance use disorders, but as you can see, it's only there for opioids and alcohol, and the alcohol one is just really not even that great. I mean, people still try to drink on alcohol, on antabuse, and they get violently ill, people with alcoholism, and also they can still do other drugs and abuse those drugs. So if you're somebody who does coke, like taking antabuse is not going to help you stop doing cocaine. So there's obviously also behavioral treatment, which is psychotherapy and 12-step. 12-step is referring to like Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous, and this is I don't know if I want to call it religious, but it is a spiritual, religious-esque type of treatment methodology, where people, find a community of individuals who are also recovering from substance use disorder. And community seems to be extremely helpful for a certain subset of individuals to recover from substance use disorder. There are still a lot of individuals who do not recover in 12-step groups, and I am for absolutely any kind of treatment methodology that helps people stay alive with this disease, because it is a very fatal disease. Outside of anorexia, it's got, I believe, the second worst mortality rate of psychological dysfunction outside of anorexia. So it's a pretty rough disease. Many people die from it. A lot of suicides are, a result of an untreated substance use disorder. So if people get help from 12-step, then I absolutely would advocate for 12-step for that person. But I do want to put out there that there are faults with 12-step, just like there are faults with any other treatment methodology. And one of the faults with 12-step is that they are very rigid about maintaining complete abstinence from all drugs of abuse. So depending on the group that you go to, if you're on replacement therapy like Suboxone and methadone, they will not consider you sober or clean in certain 12-step groups. I'm not saying every 12-step group is like that, but I do know that there is a large portion of them that would think that because they maintain their method of essentially success is abstinence and maintaining abstinence on a daily basis over long periods of time. So, they also, a problem with 12-step is that they tend to say that if individuals relapse, it was the individual's fault and it was not the fault of the treatment methodology, which I think is inherently flawed. As I've already kind of talked about previously in other treatments like with, saying that people that are obese just need to work out and eat less. It's like, yes, that's true, but why can't people work out and eat less? There's like an underlying issue there that's getting in the way of that. And similarly with 12-step, generally their suggestion is if you can't stop drinking or doing drugs is to go to more meetings, go to 3 meetings a day, go to 6 meetings a day. And that can, if you're in a place like Southern California, that's not a problem at all. But if you're in a place like the middle of Wyoming, I don't know that it's feasible to go to 6 AA meetings a day there or in the middle of Tennessee or something, for instance. Psychotherapy also has its own issues, whether that be cognitive behavioral therapy or actual like psychotherapy or some kind of psychoanalytic therapy or something like that. It can be helpful, but it's kind of like 12-step. I think that most individuals that are in recovery are using multiple methodologies with pharmacological treatments as well as therapy, as well as 12-step potentially. Like, for sure naltrexone is not looked down on in 12-step, but I'm not so sure about Suboxone and methadone. I think that people still look at that as you're kind of using. Anyway, there's also harm reduction, which is, it's not giving up on people, but it's just accepting that there is a percentage of the population that is addicted to drugs or that have a substance use disorder that are not going to stop. And so we need to, as a society, ask ourselves, what do we want to do with these people? Do we just want them to die? You know what I mean? Or do we want to lock them up in jails and prisons and institutions? What do we want to do with them as a society? I'm not making a judgment call, but, we can reduce the spread of disease by giving clean paraphernalia, and we can also reduce violent crimes by giving people a place to live. So there is some European countries that will give out clean needles and actually give people a place to do drugs. And this is an extremely controversial idea because Again, kind of with what I've talked about multiple times this summer with our country's underlying ideology, a lot of people in the U.S. would say, I don't want my tax-paying dollars to go give junkies needles and a place to inject drugs. You know what I mean? Like, that's not what I want my tax dollars to go to, which, I think is, I disagree with that because I want, I feel like I want people to survive, and I feel like we should give people the chance to do that. So I'm okay with my tax dollars going to that. But, it is I think a reasonable opinion to have, although I feel like it's a little bit callous, but it is a reasonable opinion, and I totally understand that. And decriminalization. I think that this one seems very odd to me that people are against this because we know that prohibition doesn't work. We had an entire battle against prohibiting alcohol use in our country, and what that should have taught us is that adults are going to do whatever the F they want to do. Like, adults do what adults do. And I think that criminalizing certain drugs like cannabis, like heroin, let me just say first, like cannabis and cocaine, I think that those drugs should be legalized. I think that they should at the very least be decriminalized, meaning that you aren't going to go to jail for possessing them. When it comes to certain drugs like heroin and fentanyl, I'm much more sympathetic to the regulation of those because the ability to die from them is so much easier than dying from cocaine or cannabis. You know what I mean? Like, you can't overdose on cannabis. Like, there are withdrawal symptoms. You can get addicted to cannabis, but you cannot overdose on cannabis. It's impossible. Physiologically, the amount that you have to ingest is just not possible with the kinds of products that we have available to us. Similarly with cocaine, you can absolutely give yourself a heart attack with cocaine, but it is, a relatively safe chemical. I'm not advocating for people to go out and do coke, but I'm just saying that, like, if you are a relatively healthy human being, it's unlikely that you're going to die just from doing coke. But what you will die from, unfortunately, is when you think that you're doing coke and you're actually doing fentanyl, which is, really the other problem with having these drugs criminalized and having them be illegal and only attainable through the black market in a way that does not guarantee that you're actually getting what you think you're getting. I mean, I think that for me, I think it makes the most amount of sense to sell these drugs to adults and make sure that they are pure and that they are, safe and free from, other things that will easily kill you, like putting a strong opioid in a drug that you think is a stimulant. I think that's ridiculous that we do that. But in any case, I think that we've reached the end of this lecture. So I just want to thank everybody for your time and your attention in this course. And if anybody, needs anything in the future, don't hesitate to reach out to me. I am going to be leaving Buffalo this year, but, you never know. If you ever go by University of Southern California, that's where my new job is going to be. Don't hesitate to reach out, and I will not be seeing you in the next one. So good luck on the exam.